So, I don't know about you, but I'm having trouble sleeping at night. These folks may be part of the problem. Now, I know these leaders aren't the cause of rising protectionism and reactionary nationalism and populism. They're only the symptoms, but you have to admit they do share a couple of things in common. For one thing, they've got a stubborn resistance to the facts, especially when it comes to the biggest challenges of our era. But the other more obvious thing is that they're national politicians operating in the national interest. And if I'm going to be perfectly honest, it's these nation states that are really contributing to my insomnia at night. Don't get me wrong, nation states have contributed to some of the most important dividends in terms of public goods that we've known. Think of literacy, think of public health, think of development. But they've also been contributing to some of the darkest chapters of the last 2 centuries. And I'm not entirely convinced that nation states are up to dealing with the biggest challenges of the 21st century. It's easy to forget that we're all part of a 500-year-old experiment in political engineering. And while nation states have, generated some important wins, I think they're past their due date. And one reason is because they're getting weaker. They're weakening from above because of runaway, rabid globalization, the movement of global capital, ideas, and people. But they're also weakening from below because of the rise of social networks, new technologies, global philanthropy, NGOs. And as a result, nation states and national politicians are struggling to deal with some of the biggest existential threats of our time. Think of climate change. Think of, with the rise of multipolarity, the summoning up of old threats like global war. Yet we're all of us, still trapped in a parochial idea of the nation-state system. We still think of the world in terms of national sovereignty, and I think this has to change. I think what we need are new mental maps. The world has changed, but the basic units of international affairs haven't. And I think we need to see the world now through the lens of cities, not nation-states. And this makes sense when you think about it. We're an urban species. We're Homo urbanus. What you see right here is every single city in the world with a population of 250,000 people or more. There's about 2,000 of them. And I'm going to make things really simple. The bigger, the redder the circle is, the more fragile that city is over a 15-year period. And the smaller and the bluer it is, the more resilient. Now, as you look at this map, consider the following facts. In the 1600s, when nation-states genuinely burst onto the scene, 1648, less than 1% of the world's population lived in the city. By the 1800s, early 1800s, about 3%. By the early 20th century, about 20%. Today, over 54%. In the next 20, 30 years, we're talking about 70% of the world's population living in cities. Those trends, they're baked in. They're not going to change. But future urban population growth is not going to be evenly distributed. 90% of it's going to be happening in this part of the world, in Africa and Asia, parts of the Americas. Just 3 countries, China, India, and Nigeria, account for more than 40% of all future population growth. This turbo-urbanization is going to generate some important opportunities and some challenges. On the positive side of the ledger, we're literally going to be able to design cities from scratch with the future in mind. And if you think about it, that's already happening. Think of India's attempts to push 100 smart cities forward. Think of China's incredible growth of cities. Think of Masdar here in UAE, or even Dubai, or Neom in Saudi Arabia. But the reality is that the vast majority of cities in this part of the world are not going to be planned with a future in mind. It's going to be messy. In fact, many of them are urbanizing before they industrialize, as they have in previous generations. And what that means is we're going to see a vast spread of inequality. We're going to see the global slum population swell from about 1 billion today to 2 billion by 2030. We're also going to see cities bifurcating, some global cities rising to the top, becoming the great connectors, and vast numbers of cities struggling to catch up. So this is a challenge. But despite these challenges, cities are already powering countries, and it's not the other way around. They account for more than 80% of global GDP. What you see here is light emitted from space. Red represents net emissions over a 25-year period. In other words, light's been increasing over the last 25 years. Green is static, it's more or less stayed the same, and blue, it's receding. City power is quite literally lighting up the world. Megacities, metropolitan clusters, special economic zones around the world are increasingly displacing nation states as the anchor of our economy. Now, cities are connected through digital and physical infrastructure that in many cases is starting to transcend national boundaries. These linkages are the new circuitry of our global economy. And some cities are becoming so economically powerful that they're rivaling nation states in terms of their GDP. Just think about it. Think of New York. New York's got a nominal GDP of about $1.5 trillion. That makes it bigger than Australia, South Korea, and Spain. Dubai, $105 billion nominal GDP, which makes it bigger than Morocco or Oman in GDP terms. So cities are punching way above their weight economically, but they're still pulling punches politically. And that's going to have to change if cities are going to deal with some of the biggest challenges they face. They're going to have to exert their urban sovereignty to match national sovereignty. Because like nation states, cities are facing mega challenges. And I'm going to talk about some of those challenges and some of the solutions in my remaining time. And I'm going to be using EarthTime, which is data visualization created by Carnegie Mellon's Create Lab, together with my institute and many others. And what we've done is taken 30 years of satellite data, superimposed it with 300 different data sets to give people a better sense of their world and interact and engage with that data. And this is really important because it's free. It's available to all. If you go to earthtime.org, you can check out this data yourself. So what are some of the big mega threats? A big challenge is war. Armed conflicts are multiplying and metastasizing. And what you see here is every single individual conflict death over a 20-year period. Today's conflicts are harder to stop than ever, and they're becoming increasingly urban. We had some hope at the end of the Cold War that conflicts would come down, and they did for a period. And that was mostly due to increased spending on peacekeeping and peace building around the world, but they're coming back up again. With the resumption of geopolitical rivalries, we're seeing conflicts on the rebound. They almost doubled in the last 10 years, from about 30 to 50. And the number of people dying has increased tenfold in the last 10 years, many of them in cities. Terrorism is another big concern for cities. Terrorist acts are concentrated in cities, but it hasn't always been that way. What you see here are terrorism deaths reported by the GTD, which is a terrorism data set. Europe used to be the main theater in the 1960s and 70s. But today, especially since 2001 and the 2003 intervention in Iraq, it's moved to the Middle East, to North Africa, to parts of South and Central Asia. And cities are targeted on purpose. The idea is to paralyze the city, divide communities, precipitate an exaggerated response from national authorities. Now, with terrorism comes refugees. Lots of refugees. Right now, there are 68 million people on the move. 25 million of them are refugees. Now, what you're going to see up here in a moment are dots. Each dot represents 17 individual people. And behind each of these dots is going to be a story of struggle and survival. But in addition to refugees are 36 million internally displaced people. And we're facing an unprecedented surge in the last couple of decades. The vast majority of refugees today are moving to cities. So what you're seeing here are 17 people per dot. The numbers are significant and worrying. Just take the case of Syria. Between 2014 and 2015, as all of you know, about 1.5 million people moved from Syria in two large columns across the Mediterranean up towards Germany and Sweden and other European countries. What people often forget is that 5 to 6 million Syrians moved right next door to Lebanon, to Jordan, to Turkey. In fact, 10% of the world's refugees make it to the West. 90% are eking out a living closer to home. And virtually all refugees are fleeing terrorism and violence. They're not bringing it despite what you read in sensationalist media headlines. So it's important to recognize that even a small number of refugees, though, can create dramatic political repercussions. Now, political refugees are just a tip of human dislocation of what's to come. As all of you know, global warming, it's been a big subject of this meeting, are contributing to dangerous hothouse Earth-type scenarios. And these are temperature anomalies above and below the global mean going back several years. I'm just going to speed it up all the way to the last couple of decades. One of the outcomes of rising temperatures around the world, as all of you know, is rising sea levels. Rising seas are dangerous, especially because 2/3 of the world's cities are coastal. And it's not just displaced people we have to worry about. Rising seas are translating into salinized farmland, into the ruination of aquifers and surface water reserves. And what happens with rising seas, of course, are effects on cities. This is Shanghai, a city of 24 million people. What I'm showing you here is changes in temperature in relation to changes in land cover. So as temperature rises between 0 to 4 degrees, we're seeing land rise as well. At 2 degrees Celsius, the Paris targets, Shanghai disappears. So will large numbers of cities across the coast of Asia. Delta cities in India and Bangladesh are also particularly exposed. Think of Mumbai, a city of 18 million people. Climate scientists estimate that up to 40% of Mumbai's coast, 40% of the coast where most vulnerable people are living, could be gone before the end of this century. And it's not just Asia. Also across Northern Europe and around Western Europe, you're seeing the threat of rising sea levels. The Netherlands is going to be underwater at 1.5 degrees. Now, the Dutch know this more than anybody else, and they've been preparing for this for generations. They've got breakwalls and channels and canals and all the rest. But the point is they're also changing their mindset. They're imagining a world underwater, or at least a floating world. And this is important. Miami, the entire eastern seaboard of the United States, from Manhattan all the way down to Houston, is going to be affected. It's already experiencing major challenges, and Miami goes under 2 degrees Celsius. Now, Miami's in panic mode. I mean, they're investing in municipal bonds, they're investing in pumps, or they're doing everything they can. But because Miami is, on porous limestone, there's nothing really you can do to prevent between 3 and 5 meters of rise within the next 75 years. Now, there is an irony here that won't be lost on some of you, which is that Mar-a-Lago, the winter White House, the home of the climate denier-in-chief, will be one of the first places to go. But this is not the time for schadenfreude, right? This is, climate change is real, including right here in Dubai. Climate change is going to be causing a series of retreats of several kilometers. We can expect dynamic flooding affecting large tracts of the coast here, and I'm sure many of you are already aware of this. Abu Dhabi has about 760 kilometers of coastline, over 200 islands that dot the coast. Temperatures above 2 degrees Celsius mean that up to 2 to 4 kilometers of coastline are going to be disappearing. That's 85% of the population, more than 70% of this country's GDP that's going to be affected. So rising temperatures are going to be deadly for cities. The melting of ice caps has implications for not just rising water, but also water shortages, heat island effects, and pollution. And the burning of fossil fuels and forests are chiefly to blame. What you're seeing here is fires from space, captured from NOAA, a satellite. And what you're seeing here is both industrial and forest emissions. And you'll see a few patterns, big blooms above and below the equator. That's mostly due to slash and burn agriculture, which when done to excess can generate enormous challenges in cities. Urbanization is also to blame, because as you move out subdivisions, you increase the likelihood of forest fires from taking hold. Now, forest fires are asphyxiating cities across Asia. The WHO estimates that more than 7 million people died prematurely because of forest fires, because of pollution in cities last year. And this is a chronic problem. If any of you have ever been to Beijing or Delhi, or you happen to live there, you'll know what I'm talking about when the smog comes in. Just walking around an afternoon in New Delhi today is equivalent of smoking 20 cigarettes. So it's also affecting North American cities, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. You'll see anybody who's living in California or even lives in the East Coast recognizes that the number of forest fires has resulted in acute respiratory infections, increases in cancer, all sorts of allergies and asthma in populations that live thousands of kilometers away. Gas and flare emissions are also a big challenge. What you see here is the Bakken oil fields. This is from hydraulic fracturation, what we call fracking. Just the gas flares alone in this one field in North Dakota are the equivalent of 1 million cars on the road a year. And of course, we know a lot about gas flaring in this part of the world. Now, deforestation. Of course, deforestation is a big issue. The Amazon is under siege right now. What I'm going to show you is one single road in the northern state of Rhodonia. On either side, you see land that's being cleared for soy, for sugar, and most importantly, for cattle. And this is being driven by insatiable appetites in markets across the industrial and industrializing world. What you can see here now is over a 16-year period, in red, the net losses of forests over that same period. This is land being converted to agricultural production. This is just one small strip. Now we are at a point where we're reaching irreversible tipping points, where literally, water shortages due to loss of transpiration and precipitation are generating shortages in cities across Brazil and cities across Latin America. There is some hope, though, which is that these are parks that are spread out and protected areas across Brazil. There are 1,800 of them. That these do, in fact, limit, to some extent, global encroachments. Now, I'm sorry for the doom and gloom. I did warn you I was having trouble sleeping at night. Now, in my remaining couple of minutes, let me try to summarize a few solutions. I think cities are already taking action on many of these challenges, and they're a good bet, because cities are creative, they're resourceful, they're innovative. City mayors are pragmatic, they're accountable, precisely because of their proximity to the people. So what are cities doing? Well, let me outline just 6 very quickly. First, cities are setting a plan, and they need to set a plan. This is really obvious, right? Most cities, believe it or not, actually don't have a plan, a vision, a roadmap for where they're going. But without a roadmap, without goals, metrics, and targets and indicators, you're flying blind. Now, Dubai has taught us that lesson, but so has Curitiba, a city in southern Brazil. In the 1960s and 70s, Curitiba set a vision to become the most equal and sustainable city in Brazil. And every couple of years, it updated that plan, and today it has one of the highest levels of human development in the country. And this is in one of the most unequal countries on the planet. So the importance of setting a plan and sticking to it and having the discretion and autonomy to deliver on it is a critical lesson. Second, go green. Cities are leading a global revolution in green energy and the circular economy. Many are building green buildings. We're going to talk about that in our session. Many of them are getting smarter about zoning and retrofitting and refurbishing, not just building. Others are rolling out green canopies and building solar rooftops and green rooftops. Singapore is a great case on so many levels. It's one of the densest populations in the world, but it's a model of green planning. It set aside hundreds of acres and planted millions of trees to serve as the lungs of the city. It also is one of the largest water reservoirs in the world, generated from rainwater, but also from recycled water. So it's become a world hydro hub, and it's exporting that expertise all over the world in terms of integrated water management. Third lesson, diversify your grid. Cities have more leverage over public utilities, I think, than often they realize. And some cities are transforming their energy grids. They're investing in community solar and wind. They're also looking at decentralized energy production and embedded energy. This is the global distribution of wind power. What you'll see over time, if it comes up, is basically the spread of wind production from parts of Europe through to North America and into Asia. Fourth, build densely and sustainably. The death of any city, as all of you know and as our panelists are going to talk about today, is sprawl. When cities are zoned right, they can reduce emissions and become more livable, but they can do so much more than that. They can also improve lifestyles, they can increase real estate values, they can produce more affordable housing. I think the future isn't about electric cars or even automated cars. The future is a city without cars. The way not to do this is Las Vegas. Las Vegas sprawled over the last 30 years. Why? Because less than 4% of Las Vegans use public transport to get to work. Virtually everyone drives, and it's no wonder that it's the most congested city, one of the most congested cities in America. Fifth, invest in integrated and multi-use solutions. The most successful cities are those that invest in solutions that don't solve just one problem, but that solve multiple problems. And cities are expert at doing more with less. When designed right, integrated public transport can reduce congestion and emissions, but it can also improve health and well-being, reduce dispersion, reduce crime, make cities safer. This is Seoul. Seoul's population has doubled in the last 30 years in terms of its overall population size, but the footprint has stayed almost exactly the same. Why? Because 90% of the population uses public transport to get to work. They're rightly proud of having one of the best transport systems in the world. So let me conclude by simply saying the last lesson, which is that cities need to come together and work together. Cities have always been where the future happens first. They've always been laboratories of innovation, of experimentation, and they're taking action. They're way ahead of nation states in terms of setting emissions reductions targets. They're way ahead of nation states in terms of setting inclusive policies to welcome migrants rather than keeping them away. But cities have to start working together if they're really going to get the kind of collective action and be heard. That's because cities have been left out of international decision making for virtually all of history, and they need to assert their political power. This is going to require renegotiating the relationships with the national authorities, in some cases through cooperation, in other cases through conflict. It will obviously be helpful if they do work in cooperation, but it'll also be helpful if they work in global coalitions. Today, there are more than 300 intercity networks around the world, more networks for cities than there are for nation states. About 200 of those are national, but 100 are international. Think of the C40 or the UCLG or ICLE or the Global Parliament of Mayors. What these networks do is they amplify city voice. They can help cities leapfrog old technologies and move directly to new ones. At this moment, when our nation states are paralyzed and our international institutions are struggling to come up with collective action solutions, cities and their leaders are getting stuff done. It's because they're diverse, because they're dynamic, because they're open, because they're cosmopolitan, that they're also triggering renewals from their citizens from below. So I think if we scale just even a couple of these solutions, maybe some of us will sleep better at night. Thanks a lot.